Hello and welcome to the Dungeon Masters Guild House. This is a weekly podcast where I, your host Matthew Whitby, sit down with people all across the tabletop RPG space. And this week, I'm delighted to be joined by Joe Raso. Hello.
Howdy.
Thank you so much for taking the time to join me.
Yeah, I'm pretty excited to be here. You had a whole pile of awesome folks on your show already, Matthew.
I must admit, thank you again. I'm just as kind of flabbergasted as you are, as some of these people kind of agreed to sit down and have a chat. But I did want to say, I think you have like one of the most impressive I write like tabletop RPG content backgrounds I've ever seen. You've got like the whiteboard, you've got like the bookshelf filled to the brim with like different editions and stuff. It's impressive.
Yeah, the whiteboard was an addition last year that I was quite thrilled with. I don't tell my employer this, but I stole an old whiteboard from the offices that wasn't being used, so I've made a good use of it so far.
No, I mean it's always a case of like I've always thought about getting a whiteboard, but then I just kind of I just have like a notepad and pen where I just make my lists, and then I've tried doing the thing where you like create what's it like Trello, and you have like those digital lists. Yeah, I don't know. There's something tangible about being able to like cross something off, or
yeah, I enjoy that whole thing. Sometimes just create a list and cross things off to make you feel like you've accomplished something, even though it might have been pick up your coffee cup or
just the go-to one is like make to-do list. Done.
No, honey, I really was productive today. See, I got.
Yeah, I ticked off like 7 things. Well then, Joe, I guess for the people listening, then, what sort of products have you been creating?
I guess the thing that sold best for me thus far, I've got a Forgotten Realms campaign guide to the Great Dale up on the DMsGuild. I released that 2019. But I think I've done a pile of different hard to categorize sort of stuff. I've done some adventures, I've done lore, I've done monsters, the heck have I done?
And I think it really gets to that point of like when you hit like I don't know like 20 plus products, it gets to the point of like I've done I think I've done a lot. And nothing's worse than when you forget that you've done something.
Yeah, and you're thinking, oh shoot, I meant to mention this thing because it was I worked with this guy and it was really good.
So one of the first questions I always kind of like to ask then is like, so what was the kind of products that you kind of got yourself started with? Where did it all begin?
So the first thing I released was in spring of 2018, I think it was. The title is The Phase Anger. It was a side trek adventure, kind of like I think it was just really one encounter. My intention was to have created a full sort of multi-session adventure, but because I'd never really built anything on the guild yet, I figured, okay, I saw this advice on starting as small as possible. So I just crunched it down to, hey, here's the one encounter, and I split this adventure into 3 little bits. So my first 3 productions were the connected short encounters. And it's funny, you look back to the thing that you did so long ago.
Yeah.
And I love it so much because I think I did a decent job of getting a fun story, and for me, having a story making sense is a big deal. But but when I look at it and I go, wow, that production's terrible.
I think that's the journey though, isn't it? I think like there's I like I said, I'm envious of anyone who can kind of like look at their like or whose first work is kind of as consistent in quality as like their current work. It's like it's like a journey. And well then I guess like to kind of follow on from that, which is like, so what made you want to actually like start publishing stuff?
Well, I think like a lot of forever DMs out there, we're out there creating our own little worlds and adventures, and I always have this fancy dream of, oh, I'll be published one day. And I remember in university I had piles of notes and things of, oh yeah, I'll be able to compile this into the big new campaign setting or whatever, and it never really came to fruition because life gets in the way and you have other good things to do. But then I guess Wizards opened up their DMsGuild in the 5 or 6 years ago, and suddenly that wasn't such a large hurdle, and there's so many products out there from those of us who sat in our little rooms making up our worlds and creating adventures that now you have an easy outlet to produce stuff. So I was looking enviously at the early creators that went up there with, like Phil Beckenwith and Jeff Stevens and the like, and well, maybe I can start doing that big pile of stuff I have hidden in the corner, and so I dove in.
No, so then I also like how it feels like you kind of, again, from the get-go, avoided one of the more common pitfalls of, like, I don't know, first-time creators of, like, project scope. Just because it is hard to, like, when you first, like, okay, I'm going to do it, you're always like, okay, well, this is, like, my dream idea. It's, like, I don't know, on the scale of, like, a setting guide. And you're just like, for a project, like, scope, it's, like, it's too big.
That... I fell into that trap. Actually, my bestseller, the Great Dale Campaign Guide, it is exactly that trap I fell into. I reached out to Jeff Stevens, who I was hugely thankful for. I think it was maybe 6 months after I published my first thing. He was looking for new folks to contribute to one of his adventure count compilation books, and so I was hugely thankful that he let me contribute something to it. And so I approached him later and saying, hey, I've always wanted to write this nice adventure. Would you, and there's another fellow, Carl Resch, who I'd communicated with as well, would you like to join us so the three of us write this adventure? Oh, great, yeah. And I was shocked to realize he said yes. That was wonderful. And we started laying out a story, captured some of our ideas, and I wanted to have the story placed in the Forgotten Realm somewhere. So I began scouring because there's a whole pile of lands, as I'm sure you well know, outside the Sword Coast. And I came across the Great Dale, which a lot of the lore and backstory fit or nicely dovetailed with some of the things that we were thinking about for the adventure. So I said, well, here, let me dig deep and find all the Great Dale lore I could find. Anything, since the old third edition days, fourth edition days.
Was that kind of the last time that because again, I know depending on the area of, the areas of the realm that is actually technically forgotten,
yes.
they kind of haven't necessarily got updates from, like, I know that some areas are like, you always have to, like, go diving back to, like, first edition books. Was the Great Dale kind of revisited?
So from my point of view, the best source of information on it was a third edition source book called The Unapproachable East. And I just assumed that there'd be more stuff built afterwards, because I wanted to update it to the current Forgotten Realms calendar, the current year. And in the fourth edition Forgotten Realms campaign guide, I think they had one page back in front with some information on how the spell plague messed the world up a little bit. But I couldn't find anything else. It's like, oh, well, it's an open slate. We can kind of add a couple things here and there. And in one of the Facebook groups, I chatted with R.P. Davis, who's done a bunch of other Forgotten Realms items. And he's going, oh, yeah, it'd be great to do a sort of a campaign guide update for that area. You might want to think of this and this, but I'm way too busy to do it, Joe. Why don't you run with it? It's like, oh, okay, well, I'll see what I can do. And I reached out to 3 or 4, and it exploded into 10 folks without trying too hard. And so my little lore backstory search for this adventure I was doing on the side exploded into a 130-page campaign guide, which was probably more than I frankly should have done.
I think you're kind of like, it's common though, for, like, because again, the DMsGuild, you kind of need to be working with, to get the most out of it, working with, like, the Wizards IP. And the blessing and the curse of using the Forgotten Realms is the backstory or the history that the land kind of has. And when you begin to deviate from, like, the Sword Coast, where things aren't as well defined, you are essentially creating your own setting, or like you're kind of like building on. Again, the lore established in like the fourth edition is about, I think, like 1,000 years, maybe like 500 years out of date now. And it's a case of like, okay, well, essentially all this established law is out of date, so now we have to kind of like imagine what the future would be. And if like, again, I've had the same thing where like you start it from like an adventure writing standpoint of like, oh, I want to tell this kind of story, and to adequately be able to tell your story, you need to create like a campaign guide or like a gazetteer or something to kind of say, okay, this is kind of what's going on in this area, because there's been nothing otherwise, and you can't just like sort of info dump it at the front of an adventure.
Yeah.
But no, I was gonna say, so, and then when did I guess like at what point in the kind of the project scope of the Great Dale did other people kind of start, like, I don't know, start coming on board?
It was fairly early, and I'm struggling to recall exactly how it grew. I reached out to some individuals that I'd either worked with in the past or I'd met online, and I think I had a large list of, hey, I should contact these. And I came up with 20 or 30. And after the first 10 or 12, 90% of them said, yeah, sure, that sounds great. I realized, well, how am I going to do this?
Yeah.
One of the challenges of, and I know you're more than aware of this on self-publishing, is the cost and mechanics of how to break even for any production. And because I wanted to make the product of a reasonable quality. I want to get some artists to actually contribute work for that. But as soon as you do that, then suddenly, oh, that's costs. And okay, well, I've got a writer contributing. How do they get compensated? Okay, well, we'll parse out, portions of the sales, but then your portion that's available to recoup all the costs that you've invested in the art. And then I wanted to get an editor, because I realized that you can't edit your own stuff.
It's always a worthwhile investment.
It all adds up, so that I think I've completely gone off on your original question.
No, I was gonna say it, but no, it kind of is that case of like, sometimes when reaching out for like collaborators, it is that case of like, you always have like, oh, it'd be really nice to get these people involved. And yeah, I can imagine that thing of like having that long list of like, it would be awesome to work with all these people, and you assume like, oh, they're all going to be so busy, they're not going to have time to kind of contribute. And then just hearing like, oh yeah, no, I can do it, yeah, or just like,
and then it becomes a problem of, well, how do I make it work with the limited budget and limited supply? So
I think that's another funny thing though, is I think a good number of people in the like tabletop RPG spaces, they're both really good at spinning multiple plates, but they're also really bad because they're always spinning multiple plates, and maybe sometimes they should maybe say, it's a lesson I think you learn with time. But I don't know, yeah, it's always fortunate when, like, the stars align and you get to kind of work on someone that you kind of always kind of appreciate their work, or you've looked up to them. You kind of have to pinch yourself a little bit.
Yes, I do that all the time.
And one thing I actually did want to chat about, because talking about kind of breaking down the sort of reaching down the break-even point, you've actually been quite open, like in terms of your blog, about almost like the financial side of like project management and kind of going through with that. I'm curious as to kind of I suppose why, but I don't mean it in like such a sort of flippant sense. What was kind of the urge to kind of be so open about that side of?
I'm not sure, honestly. I guess I had this vision of slowly building a spot for me in the RPG creating space, and I wasn't really sure how I would do that. And so I created this little blog that I'm horrible at updating, but I like to try to at least stick something there once a month.
Yeah.
And I thought, well, what content would folks with a similar background like me be interested in knowing and sharing? And so I think that's where the impetus came from, is to say, well, what would I be interested in reading? And it's by sharing that information, it's not hurting me in any way. And one of the things that I thought is useful by doing so is slowly helping to change the dynamic of buyers in the marketplace too, because there's large sections of the public who might think, well, you should just make it free. Like it's just words on paper. It's just, you're sticking a value to an intangible asset that doesn't make sense. It should be free and distributed everywhere. But ultimately, there's folks that make this a living, like the artists that contribute stuff. That's their job. They have to get if they don't get paid for it, then how are they gonna get it's put roof over their head kind of thing?
They're not going to have time to make the stuff that you appreciate, but that you somehow still want for free.
Sure, yeah. And I think one of the hard things with our hobby is the spectrum of folks that participate and create stuff, because you'll have a person playing on the weekends. They'll make a couple things. Hey, I can produce this. I'll throw up on the DMsGuild. It costs me 0 cents, so I'm going to charge 0 cents for it, which is perfectly valid and it makes sense too. But then you've got an individual on the other side who that's all they do. They're focused on creating it, and it takes a lot of time and effort to do. And they're very different ends of the spectrum, and understandably, how they approach the costing of it has to be different.
I think there is that kind of interesting kind of, I guess, debate or discussion around about the kind of like, I guess, commercialization of a hobby. In something, because again, for the people who it is truly a hobby and stuff like that, they're just doing it for fun. They're kind of putting their stuff out there. And the people who are kind of like, it's kind of, I don't know. I feel like, at least for me, there is like a clear line in my head about what I'm kind of doing as like hobby design of like stuff that I'm kind of putting in front of my players at like my weekly sessions. Although to be honest, most of what I do is mostly improv because I have unpredictable players.
You're not supposed to tell the players that.
But then on the other side, like the stuff that I'm actually like, okay, well, this is like project kind of time. But yeah, I can definitely imagine where there are kind of people who kind of have that line between the two is blurred. That kind of makes it kind of a weird space to kind of be a creator in.
So your original question was, why did I share that information? And I think it helps to educate folks that, hey, there's time, effort, and money being invested in these lovely things that you're seeing there. Hence why people have to actually charge some funds. Otherwise, I'm subsidizing the world. And I'd like to be a nice guy, but I can't subsidize the entire world.
Yeah, I mean, like I said, artists, again, go to like the at the very least, the artists who are actually creating like pieces of art to go into, but they need money for their work, which I hope isn't a controversial statement.
How dare you pay those artists?
But then, so I guess kind of across the kind of catalog of content you've kind of been creating, you have mentioned yourself that it is quite a mix. You've kind of bounced around between subclasses, kind of adventures, kind of collaborations. Is there any reason, like, is it the case you kind of enjoy designing a little bit of everything that you've kind of just gravitated around or bounced about, or?
Yes. I think I have a hard time saying no. Somebody comes up with an idea and says, oh, that sounds fun. So let me dive in and kick some words out to that individual. Really, it's for me. I'm hoping to make this more than just a hobby kind of thing on the side. I want to dive and work in this hobby as a business over the long haul. And I think if I want to be able to do that, I need to work on my creative muscles in all these different areas. So if I haven't, I think I can create a monster in my sleep because I've built so many of them. Adventures, I've done a chunk. I understand the flow through, but I probably have to dive more and lift a little heavier meat in that section as well. Lore campaign guides, for me, it's easy. I love the whole sort of story and background and giving ideas for folks to work with. So the more places I feel I can get my fingers into, I think helps me as being a more well-rounded and
it kind of helps you kind of be kind of more versatile. But then I guess so if you had to choose, so if from today going forward you had to only be like a one type of project, like only monsters, only like adventure guides, or sorry, setting guides, only adventures, what would you pick? What stands at the top?
So I'm going to cheat a little bit because for me I like campaign guides because you can stick everything in there. For me, a good one includes little bits of adventures that you can run off with and get your feet wet in a given setting. They have monsters in there, and they have lots of story that help develop stuff. So I like playing in that where you're fleshing out a world and creating ideas for folks to.
I know. I must admit, I think I don't think the question is kind of. I don't think it's cheating too much, but I think there is always the caveat, because with like setting guides, it's so much more work. Again, for like a fully kind of fleshed out setting guide, it is easier to hit that 50-page, 100-page, like some like 300-page like count, just because.
And frankly, if you look at it from an economic standpoint, it's not a good idea, because you can do much. Oh, this is maybe the wrong way to state it. I think you can make a better return for your time by making a whole bunch of small things and selling it for a little bit than one big gigantic volume that sure you charge more for it, but and again, it all becomes. You throw that out the window if one becomes a gigantic multi-platinum seller.
That's what I mean. I don't really know, because like looking at like the history of the DMsGuild, it is that tough one where like it's kind of these kind of singular like all-purpose products. Like this is your go-to guide for the Great Dale, rather than having that split up in multiple things and stuff like that. But again, it's a case of like you can't predict what goes well on like the.
Ultimately, you just, as a creator, you have to follow where your interests lie. And at one point I'll go, oh, I'm going to create something in this space, whatever the heck it might be. And usually it ended up migrating somewhere else. The key is to actually finish something, and putting it out there.
No, I like that. I think I've said this before on the podcast, but I'm in a similar track myself. I wanted to, I'm in the works of doing a long saddle setting guide, or just kind of like, just because it's mentioned a lot, and obviously everyone likes kind of like wizard cowboys, but there's not like an up-to-date version of it, and it was a case of like I was like, I want to do an adventure here, and then I was like, well, I can't really do an adventure here without kind of explaining what's going on in the land. And then it's got to the point where now I was like, I don't even want to do adventure anymore. This like writing the setting guide has been so much work that I just want to try and like finish it and get it out there. And I think like, again, this is, it's kind of, that's kind of what is fun about kind of working with the Forgotten Realms lore. But I'm kicking myself because I'm trying to, there is the Harpell family of wizards, who kind of, they're kind of known for being kind of eccentric. And they kind of hop out throughout, I just don't know what I'm trying to make a family tree, and it's not easy work, because the one thing they say is that there's a lot of them and there's no real consistency about any sort of lineage. So I'm just but the thing, it's fun. I get to like make it up. I've got like all the kind of like all the Harpells mentioned in lore, and then to fill in the gaps and to make it so it's not like a complete like incestuous family tree. I'm having to like create like, I don't know, like 50 new characters, and it's like a case of like, well, that's I think that summarizes the I don't know, the pitfalls of tabletop RPG design. It's like I wanted to write an adventure, and now I'm doing a family tree of like 50 bloody wizards.
And I think for me that describes a little bit the evolution of some of the RPG materials out there. to risk highlighting how old of a grognard I'm slowly becoming. I played in the 1E days, and a lot of the well-loved for good reason adventures, you look at them and you're going, well, that doesn't make sense. Why is there this gigantic cave system with these 5 different groups kind of living harmoniously together?
Yeah.
And the first time that I go, oh, now that makes sense. I think it was I don't know where in chronological order it came out, but the Sinister Secret of Saltmarsh I picked up. And this was the early 80s, and I read through, and there was, for me, it felt like, oh, there's a reason why this thing's here, and there's a backstory and how it links to the greater beyond. And so anytime I work on stuff, I'm always asking those sort of questions of, well, sure, you've got this wizard rogue in the basement of this old haunted house. What does that mean? Why is he there? And who's the next? So then you have to go, okay, he came from over here, and he doesn't want to be there because he bumped nose with a rival. So he's, oh, well, who's that rival? And then and it's this. That's where that scope creep question that you sort of suggested becomes clear, where at some point you have to put a boundary and just know to put the little sign, dragons be this way kind of thing, and stop digging.
But I think it is, again, that's kind of the fun of, like, especially when it comes to like smaller contained adventures, is you can kind of get away with those kind of like the kind of tangents that kind of suggest a wider world outside the scope of the adventure. But yeah, in other times and stuff, particularly with it really varies on the kind of project. But yeah, sometimes you do kind of fall into those kind of like things of like I don't know what it is. I think we it sounds like we align in the fact that we like there to be some semblance of logic in the case of like, oh, it's not the case of like, oh yeah, there is just a beholder in the basement and everyone just knows, oh, that's the beholder in the basement.
I think it highlights one of my weaknesses, I would say, in RPG creation is I have to force myself to turn up the fantastical dial, because all too much I end up being on the practical. Well, but why would they build a tower like that here? That doesn't make sense. Whereas that's the big fun part of games a lot, is to come across some nonsensical, fantastic event, person, creation, whatever, and deal with it. And so that's the battle I have as a writer when I'm creating stuff, is how do I make it make sense but still be wonderstruck type of material that people go, oh, okay.
And it is easy 9 times out of 10 to go like, oh, well, it's an eccentric or evil wizard. And the moment you kind of slap on those labels, it's a case of like, oh, they'll do anything, it's a case of like, they just wanted to. So back to you then, and kind of like your creative process as a whole. When you're coming up with like, okay, well, I've got some time, I want to start a new project. What's kind of first steps for you?
Yeah, I struggled with reading through your questions earlier, and I realized the first steps for me are never consistent. It's always getting inspired by different items. I find I'm very visual, so I love scanning the different art in the books that are produced, just to get my wheels kind of churning on an idea. But other times I'll be watching a movie and I go, oh, that would be great if I just twisted these couple things and it would fit a fantasy world so well. So I would say the initiation of a project is pretty varied. But the moment that I decide to transition into something that's going to be a product or going to be something I produce, I sit down and outline it. just the top high level headings. I usually end up ripping them apart and creating new headings later on, but I want that structure of knowing where the thing starts, what are the bits in the middle, and where the thing ends. I've never written a novel, but I have a feeling if I were to try to do one, I would probably create this gigantic table of contents at the beginning saying, oh, this happens here, this happens, which is maybe different than how other folks might approach it. But that's pretty consistent for me. I always creating an outline, always figuring out what bits I need to fill in. And I try to, that's going to be this big and that's going to be this small. And
you try and like, I think that's another good as well. It's like with more experience, you kind of get a pretty good idea of like, okay, well, this should be roughly this kind of size or scale. As your projects have kind of gone on, obviously you kind of you've started kind of leading kind of more kind of collaborations as well. Is it kind of when you're kind of creating the skeleton of the document, is that kind of the point where you start thinking of like, okay, well, this would benefit from getting a few more people involved? Or is it like, I'm curious about what point in the project you kind of realize maybe this is too big for me, or it would be really cool to have X to do this, or
I think in general, I always like to have, other voices come on in any creation that I do. No matter how hard I try, when I look at something, I'm only going to see it from my point of view. And the moment I get another person to look at it, and this again relates to my challenge of making things fantastical enough. Is that a real word? But
if not, we've just made a new word, and that's awesome. Fantastical in itself.
Let me know who I should bill for that. The getting another person to contribute ideas is of huge value. So anytime I can get somebody to lend a hand, I will. But again, for me, it ends up being a bit of a size and economics issue. Like for a small production, it really doesn't make sense to get folks involved, because if I want to be fair to them, then they need to receive a certain portion or certain amount, and I think it's hard to do with a small piece. Whereas once it gets big enough, there's stuff to share, I guess.
I think in terms of like on like a at least on a bare minimum, not bare minimum, but the act of having someone like someone else like collaborate on a project, just being able to have someone as like a sounding board to kind of bounce back an ideas is kind of exceedingly valuable. And two, like subconsciously, there's almost like a level of kind of like accountability that can kind of help the project kind of like, again, working on your own, especially when you're not like, you don't have like a deadline that you're going to be passing off to the editor. It's easy to kind of, fall in those dips of like, well, I don't really want to work on this right now because it's just me. It's just, I'm the only person who's going to be upset about this is me.
When you're working with a team of 10 people and you say, I don't feel like doing this right now.
You can't,
it doesn't play as well.
No. But yeah, I'm sure, and even then, if I'm sure, like, it was a group of, if you just like, I'm not really feeling, the group would collectively, they'd be like, okay, yes, we understand. But there's kind of that incentive not to.
That wholeheartedly agree.
So then, okay, well, so you've kind of, you've got your kind of skeleton of the document. What would you say is kind of the when you begin to kind of fill in the sections as you do, what is like the favorite and least favorite part of the kind of continued process from that point?
It's hard to describe. I think I've heard people describe it as when you're in the flow, when you're actually you've done your planning. You go, okay, I'm going to sit down and write. And usually, I find the first half hour I'm not terribly productive. It's just me getting my brain working around the material.
Yeah.
But at some point, there's this. Your brain changes and the words start flowing, and you're actually creating and not thinking about what you're doing. You're just doing it. Yeah. That's the part I absolutely love, when it's in the meat of a big project and all the little bits are starting to sort of appear.
No, yeah, I can see, yeah, yeah, 100% right. And I've heard kind of stories of a good number of like authors or writers who kind of try and trick their brain to kind of get into that flow state of like when they open a blank document and they write like 100 bad words. No, just like, just like, I don't know, they just get kind of the kind of the kind of, I get, it's almost like, what was it? You kind of like that when you wake up in the morning, the sleep in your eyes.
Yes.
It's kind of get the sleep out off your brain. You get the 100 words out there, or like however bad, or whatever it is, and then you enter your project like with that kind of initial rustiness, kind of. But yeah, and it's nice, especially when you kind of lean back from like when it's what's always the telltale point of like, no, I've hit that flow state is when I come out of it and I'm like, my music's been stopped for like 30 minutes. I've been listening.
There's been many times I find I like to write with music, but it can't be words in the, it has to be non-verbal. But so I'll stick my headphones on and I'll start working, and I realize I've been working for an hour and I never actually clicked start on the streaming device. That's usually a good sign.
Which is a good sign. It's like, yeah, because it was a thing of like, you're mad, but then you're not really mad, because then you're just like, well, I've been working, so I guess and then you have that little 5-minute break of actually trying to find something to listen to.
Yeah.
I think recently, yeah, it's been my go-to has always been like game soundtracks. It's always kind of good motivators. Yeah, no, so it's exactly the same. I think so many people are the same thing of like it's nice to kind of hit that flow state. But then I guess on the other side of the coin, then what would you say is your like least favorite part?
The least favorite is when the last 10% of the project, you've got the meat of everything done. You've looked at everything 1,000 times, and it's now into the final detail, reading through, proofreading type. And I realize I'm not a detail guy, which is not always good. That's why you get other people to help do that bit. But ultimately, you still have to go through check all the things that you've, and hence my list creation. Yeah. I need those, otherwise I would not have very good stuff.
I no, 100%. I think again, it's a sentiment that's kind of been echoed by so many people, is because by that last 10%, try as you might, the honeymoon period of you and that project has worn off. You're starting to have, you're looking listfully at like other projects in like your kind of folder of like, oh, I could do this idea, or I could do that idea. But I guess it goes back to the kind of thing I was saying. That's when kind of having other people involved kind of can help. Absolutely. kind of push over that last 10-minute. And typically, sometimes I find that sometimes the last 10% can also be like a good judge of like, how essential is this? Because typically it's not. Sometimes that last 10% isn't always like. It's almost like I don't know. I may just be talking out my ass, but it's like it's not always the core part of the project. It's something sometimes tangential. It's the case of like, okay, I want to write, I don't know, like 10 more encounters just to kind of as like a little bonus, or a few more kind of creatures. And sometimes in that 10%, you can just be like, I don't think this 10% is worth it.
Yep.
Gone.
Yeah, absolutely. And there might be a reason why you never wrote the 4 paragraphs on the wizard's hat, and why it always cricks in the certain way that it does. Maybe you can cut that piece.
They just don't wear hats. It's that easy, They're the hatless wizard. That's their character quirk. But I mean, yeah, that is always kind of like a good way to kind of think about it, because sometimes, again, it kind of depends, because I like, try as I might, sometimes I do like to try and like write a project kind of from start to finish and work my way down. But realistically, that's never how it works. Sometimes I'm kind of like, I need to jump around from section to section, and that's kind of when you kind of realize like, okay, well, I'm subconsciously I'm avoiding writing this for some fashion, and it's either one that like you're maybe not as comfortable writing in that area, or 2, you're just not interested in it, and forcing your, like, again, unless you can make the argument that it's absolutely pivotal, writing that you're kind of forcing yourself to do, it probably may not come across as like, I don't know. It may be the case where when it's released, people are like, "That's my favorite section," and you're like, "Why? That's
Yeah,
the part
yeah,
that But that's
yeah. And if you're doing an adventure, I think the more that you can trim and get the
Mhm.
key bit of the story and drop off the extraneous piece, because at the end of the day, somebody's running the game in their dining room, and there's 5 pages in front of them. They're only going to focus on those bits that are going to be related to the play at their table and their characters. So focus on the things that you think are important. And it's
But
probably not going to be the same thing that you might say, but
that's what I find is, again, so to go back to that comparison of like setting guides versus anything else, it's easier with an adventure to know kind of what you want to keep and what to cut. With a setting guide, it is kind of harder in that more kind of nebulous thing, because you I mean, like it's a case of like, okay, well, this section is on all about, the kind of like habitat life, for this kind of, is like, it's kind of useful to know and stuff like that, because it kind of ties this unique creature to the lore. But
and I will, from my point of view, I think it's maybe the reason why I've done campaign guides is they're easier. Whereas with I think it takes a little bit more skill to write a very good adventure, because it's doing that creative story bits, but presenting it in a way that anybody can easily pick up. And when I look back to that first production I did, the side trek, it's really not presented how I would love to do an adventure now, because I have a lovely story in there, and it's very depth and lots of detail in it. But if I were to hand that to someone today to run, they would have pages to read to figure out what the heck's going on.
Yeah.
And so there's a real skill and that I think is developed by doing it repeatedly, to be able to create those the main bits of what you need to run an adventure.
I think the tipping point for me that kind of helped me kind of shape my own adventure writing, because a good chunk is like I looked to the hardcovers for inspiration, but it wasn't until I tried writing an adventure league style adventure, because of how strict they are with their format, and kind of like how like they have kind of a telltale line of like, here's how you give the DM the information. And after I kind of did that, I was like, I mean, yes, I would. Again, it's the same thing of like, I want to tell a story. I want to use my flowery language. I want to get all those words out there. And then it's kind of the battle of two beats of like, one brain's like, nope, give the DM the bare minimum, nothing more. That it's their job to add the flavor. That's kind of putting. On the other side, it's like, well, I mean, I can maybe spend a word in the box text to talk about, the wizard's lack of a hat.
And I would say the best adventure creators are the ones that can play on both sides and know when to throw the flowery bits in, and but still have the meat that you need to run that encounter.
I think it is that case of like, especially in like if it's a location based adventure and you've got like X number of rooms, know when, like, for example, like the lavatory doesn't need a huge description. It could just be like, this is it, what it is, everyone knows what this is. And in the lead up to the final boss, then you can kind of have that language. But yeah, it's kind of that kind of playing it off. Well then, I guess it's kind of interesting then. In the kind of reflection of like looking back over your kind of like first collection of encounters, aside from learning that lesson, would you say there's another lesson that you've kind of learned over kind of like your whole tabletop RPG career?
Yeah, I would say just it's reinforced ideas I've had on what you need to do to define the goal that you want to reach, set a plan for yourself to get there, and actually keep chewing away at it over time. Is I think if whatever success means to somebody in as a creator in the RPG space, the more you can get to a point where you define your start and end points and have that road laid out for you, the easier that path of being, quote, successful, whatever that means, is. But it was funny that you're saying about the Adventurers League when writing that that was the first time you learned,
Mm-hmm.
not learn, but
Yeah, I
had some
kind of
insight
saw,
into how to create. And the same thing happened with me. I wrote for the Moonshays, the
Gamehole Con, isn't it?
yes. So I wrote no, it's Winter Fantasy.
Oh, okay.
A lot of times with Baldwin Games
Yes.
has the ownership of that. I wrote Moon 13.3, which hopefully they'll finally publish in the next little bit. But that was a fantastic learning experience for me. They asked me to write, it was a tier 3, but the premise sounded like an investigation. And once you're a tier 3, investigations are a bit of a challenge to
Keep challenging.
do.
Yeah.
But I'm still quite proud of the design that I did for that, because I wrote it in such a way that if you run that adventure at different tables, it's likely going to come up with a different result, because I've added 2 or 3 paths for players to be able to resolve things from. And learning how do I translate this crazy idea I had in my head into a meaningful read through that the DM at the table in a major convention can kind of figure out. That was a huge learning, and something I'm pretty thrilled with, actually.
What was one of the big things to kind of click to try and, again, with, because I think players do like a good kind of like murder mystery or kind of like investigation. What was kind of some of the ways that you kind of managed to kind of present it in the most kind of approachable way for the DM?
Well, there's 2 things that I did. One, I can't recall there's a writer out there that has this very nice post or series of articles on how to do investigations, on making sure you have multiple clues to get to where you want to get them to. And that was part of it. You in some ways, the first time you DM a game, you're worried that you're giving too much information to a party, and they'll get to the end all too quickly, and that's not usually the case. They'll get distracted by this cat description that you've given in the first scene that has absolutely nothing to do with the adventure. So you have to make sure that you've plugged in enough tie-ins that will get them to think or ask questions about the final endpoint.
Because I guess it's a case of like, even in the first scene, you give them 5 clues. Chances are they'll find like 2.
Yes.
And then they kind of have to work from that. And then it's a case of like, well, not every clue is going to lead straight to the end point. You kind of you stagger it, and then the next location has X number of clues. That there's always that sense of like failing forward, or at least so, even the worst group of detectives can kind of
Well, yeah, and that's what you want to do. You want to make sure that the story progresses regardless of what the players do, and they get to the exciting bits of the adventure that you want. And so the second piece that I was pretty happy with is I added I can't remember the word that I described it as being, but an escalation measure for how the town, or in this case the bad guys, are aware of what the players are doing.
Like a suspicion or like tension meter.
Yes, exactly. And so depending on what they do, it slowly clicks up. So eventually an event is triggered that forces the next bits of the story to happen. But the DM can arbitrarily change that lever whenever, however they want to, so that if the players are struggling in a certain area, well, just click up the tension meter, and hey, suddenly this event occurs that then forces the path along. So that was very useful for that sort of investigation for me. It was a tool to make sure that the story evolves regardless of how well or poorly the
and particularly, it's a kind of case of like how the constraint of knowing it's a convention adventure, which is a great convention adventure. It's a design constraint, but it's kind of the case of like, that's something you could have, again, the benefit of I guess, more open-ended one-shots that aren't within, you don't have that kind of time limit. So you can, but being able to design in a manner that like this adventure is 1 hour, like, and the DM has the tools to kind of consistently make it 1 hour is exceedingly useful for like conventions. And it's the case of like where that can now be taken out and other players can play at the game and have that kind of tool. It is much harder to take like a traditional, like a free range adventure,
Right.
and then kind of present it within, a convention scope, because then the players may go off map and, the adventure hasn't.
And I mean, that's the difference between me playing my home game with my friends, and because there is no structure. Whereas you're at a convention where you have a 4-hour time slot. So these people have paid to be there. You better make sure you give them some complete story if at all possible.
So outside of the kind of like Adventure League or like convention writing, is there like across all your other projects, is there another like other design choice that you made that you're like particularly proud of?
Another design choice that I've.
I just sorry.
I guess I'm having trouble thinking of one specific thing. I would call it a design choice. It's more a learning based on seeing what I consider to be good design or good creation on how to know when to include, this is the terrible word, fluff at the beginning, that narrative descriptive stuff, and how much I have to focus on the guts of the mechanics of the game. For me, I think I'm slowly starting to learn how to do that balance, and I don't think there's ever a point in time when you achieve the end state of having the ultimate balance between those bits. But for me, I think I'm getting to a point where I have a better feel for what's a good presentation, what's a bad presentation. I'm still going to be wrong, but I feel like I'm closer to where an ideal would be.
I think sometimes it is always the case, like sometimes it's easier to go in with the approach of like, okay, well, let's get the kind of mechanical side of things out first. Like to take like an encounter, for example, what creatures are involved, what kind of, and then you kind of build up from that thing of like, okay, well, these are their tactics. How does that kind of, like how lore-wise is their tactics kind of justified? And then you kind of, expand out. It is that case of like, it is easier to kind of use fluff as like, if fluff is a decoration, it's kind of easier to add that as like layer on top.
Yeah, and I don't like to use the word fluff, because that quote decoration is the part of the adventure that's intriguing. It's the part that pulls the story and the players in. If I just say, okay, you have a humanoid with a spear and a shield at the end of the hallway, that's mechanically correct. But it's not terribly intriguing. No. And it's that vibrant wording at the beginning is what.
Yeah, I'm trying to think of like a synonym for like fluff. I guess it's like it's the magic, perhaps. Is that you have the mechanics and the magic, and then What I don't know. It's a work in progress. We'll find the term, but I guess you get what I mean. I think like fluff has been a kind of an ongoing term for anything that isn't mechanics, but I think I think it does hold like it is of equal weight to the mechanics.
Yeah, and I think good writers know how to build that fluff in such a way that is tantalizing and makes you go, okay, I really want to know what this thing's about. And it's not just words that they've put in there because they had 200 words that they had to pad out their monster stat block with.
You got to fit those words in somewhere. Well, then, so bringing up other people and kind of looking to like broader community. Would you say there's any kind of particular group of creators or people who kind of continually inspire you in your work?
I would have to say the DMsGuild has really brought forth a whole pile of impressive folks, and it's funny, you go away from, or you don't look at the new showings for a month and you go back and there's suddenly some really awesome content there. So I'm worried I'm not even going to mention some of these great new creators come up. For me, the ones that really drove me to improve myself or think that, hey, I can participate. I think I already mentioned Jeff. Jeff, he gave my first sort of I don't know, opportunity beyond my little sidebar. Folks that I guess I look up to beyond that, I really enjoy listening to Sean Merwin and Teo Sabadea. I love their podcast, and I think they've both been in the hobby for a long time and have an innate feel for what works and what doesn't, and are able to explain that in a way that is meaningful. I mean, I might not agree with everything that might describe on a certain situation, but it's clearly understandable, and I would say 9 times out of 10 they're spot on in their review of something. So I don't know. Those are probably the few that I would call out.
No, awesome. And then I guess I think that's another thing of like sometimes it's easy to kind of almost like blink and you miss these kind of new and awesome creators kind of coming into space. Like, wow, these people must have been here for like ages, and you're like, oh wow, this is their first product out in the wild. It's like, well, that's awesome. And yeah, it's geez, it's kind of like, here's the thing is like, it's always when you kind of talk about like, you know, the almost the inception of the DMs Guild and like the kind of creators who kind of got their start around then. It is only like 4 or 5 years ago, so it feels like you know the creators are like they're like ancients, or you know, or like, but it's like no, it's all still kind of new, kind of like, you know, fertile ground of like, you know, people still coming into the hobby. It's
I expect it to evolve quite a bit over the next while, as hopefully the more and more of the game and populace kind of find that space, because it's a great place to find new content that I think is not known to a lot of the newer players coming into the hobby yet.
I think it's getting out there bit by bit, at least the DMs Guild in particular. I think slowly it's kind of, I think Wizards are starting to, or at least the social media side of things are starting to kind of adopt and kind of draw attention to it. But speaking of new releases and creations and stuff like that, what about you, Joe? What have you got in the works? You know, what's on the horizon?
Well, I have to say, this year has been extremely productive for me. I was lucky to get involved in a few Kickstarter productions. I wrote a few things. What's the name? There was a Seeker's Guide to Twisted Taverns. It was one of the biggest Kickstarters in the fall. I was, or not the fall, in the spring of this year. I contributed. Yes, I was thrilled, and I'm still pinching myself that I was able to contribute a bunch of taverns for that one. I recently worked for the Onyx Path, one of their Kickstarter. What are the extra pieces that come on?
Goals.
Stretch goals. That's the word. I wrote for the. It was a source book, really. It was an update of the Kelder Mountains. It's a Dwarven section of their Scarred Lands world. That was fun. These are all things that I've done, but they haven't quite.
That's the unfortunate side of like the Kickstarter timeline. The fact that like it you write it has a whole campaign, everyone gets things like that, and then it kind of sits in that kind of production timeline for a while.
I wrote a few things for Goodman Games. Last fall they did a open call for writers to submit monster entries. Ooh. And I was one of the lucky few that got in there. So I contributed to the big monster. I think they called it Monster Dungeon Denizens is what they called it. And I'm not sure what the release date is on that. But what's really sucking my time right now is I'm doing another campaign guide for the Forgotten Realms, Ooh. Which I'm hoping will be released at the end of this month, July. Though if unfortunately a couple things don't work out, it might slip to August.
So Tentatively, again, because podcast time is nebulous,
Yes, 2021. Sorry,
yeah,
July 2021.
it,
End of.
yeah, I like to think of people looking at the calendar like, wow, it's 2025. When did they record this?
Yes.
I've just had it in my backlog. Yeah, no, very exciting. Have you announced the place yet, or are you kind of holding that close to your
Yeah,
chest?
it's a campaign guide to Rashomon.
Ooh,
And I was there. This is another place where I was pinching myself because I reached out to some folks, and Mr. Ed Greenwood himself has contributed a couple items to it. Which
that's again that you can't again you can't get any closer to the source than that, can you?
no. So yeah, that's occupying the heck out of me. I've got some other bits on the go as well that are still in early development, but I think that's the biggest.
Well, then, wow, it's again busy, and especially, I guess it was really a case of like when you're involved in projects that kind of have the long kind of production timelines. The business varies because sometimes it's a case of like, oh, well, I've done a lot, but no one would know.
Yes.
But the important question is like for the people listening, where can they kind of hear and stay up to date with get word when things are released?
I guess the best place to follow me is on Twitter at _Joe_Raso, RASO. I do have a blog that I infrequently update. It's the schemingdm.com. But Twitter's probably the best place to find out what I'm currently finagling.
Nice. And yeah, as always, there's kind of links in the description for people to kind of find and chase that. But honestly, Joe, looking at it's been an hour. We've done it. Like,
wow,
yeah,
that was fast.
Yeah, I know. Again, blink and you miss it.
And I didn't even ask you if your life has changed now that you're a celebrity in the D&D world.
I don't know if that counts. I think I've just kind of stuck around that. Yeah.
Well, because I'm referring to was it the Dragon Plus
the Dragon.
Article?
So basically, I think I've the Dragon Plus magazine. The format is if you interview enough people will interview you.
Oh. Okay.
And yeah, no. Again, I was beyond kind of flattered to kind of when the editor-in-chief Matt kind of reached out, and we had again, us Matts have to stick together. There aren't too many Matts within the tabletop RPG space.
Yeah, they just walk all over you, don't they?
Yeah. And yeah. I guess it'll be. I don't think I've spoken about it on the podcast too much. But yeah, no, I got a chance to kind of chat about why I started this podcast. And it was just kind of an excuse to kind of chat to cool people. I don't know. It's kind of that weird recognition where I'm flattered. I'm honored. I can again in the same way that you're pinching yourself, I'm pinching myself.
So I'm sure you're having trouble walking around your town now. Probably there's fans gathering at your doorstep.
They're throwing less rocks at me, which is I think that's a good sign of changing times. But no, honestly, Joe, thank you so much for taking some time to sit down and have this chat. I think it's been delightful.
Yeah, I haven't even noticed that an hour's gone by. I was a little shocked, actually.
Again, it's my fave tricks to suck away people's time.
Excellent.
That's why I always like when I approach people to ask them, I was like, "Can I have an hour of your time?" And when they say yes, I was like, "Well, I've now gained an hour," and that's how I will live forever. But I've been Matthew Whitby. You can find me at Whitby Writes. And yeah, the long saddle thing I'm going to push myself. It may be out at this point, so to have a look in the description for that. But my most important question, as everyone's kind of been sat on the edge of the seats waiting to hear, Joe, how do we end a podcast?
I was stressing about this final ending bit for quite some time, but I think you have to harken back to the 1950s, 60s sci-fi TV shows where the narrator comes in and says, "And that ends our episode with Matthew and Joe. That will be the end of it." Or is it the end?